Burgis-Kasthala. She's an international lawyer and a senior lecturer in public international law at Edinburgh University. Her research focuses on questions of international criminal justice and human rights. Her recent published work has been on the Syria Atrocity Archives and the Commission for International Justice and Accountability in Syria. And that's what she's going to talk about today. And then after Michelle, we'll turn over to Dr. Carsten Wieland, a German diplomat who has served as advisor to no less than three UN special envoys for Syria, Brahimi, de Mistura, and Pedersen. He's also a published author. He's published 2 books on Syria. In 2012, A Decade of Lost Chances, From Damascus Spring to Arab Spring. And in 2021, his recently released book, Syria and the Neutrality Trap, The Dilemmas of Delivering Humanitarian Aid Through Violent Regimes. And that's what he's going to talk about today. So first we will hear from Dr. Burgis-Kasthala, and then there'll be a couple of minutes for questions, and then we'll then turn over to Dr. Wieland. So Michelle, welcome, and it's over to you.
Thanks very much, Ray. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Hopefully. Okay. Well, thanks so much, Ray and Jenny and everyone at MECACS for organising this talk, and it's great to Carsten, and I very much apologise that I'll have to leave early, but I look forward to future conversations. So today I just wanted to basically share some of my empirical research on Syria in relation to some various actors and various initiatives that have been taking place in the field of international criminal justice. And in particular, I'm going to share with you some of my own ethnographic work on CIJA, the Commission for International Justice and Accountability, as well as the UN mechanism called the International Independent and Impartial Mechanism for Syria. And basically, I'm going to use these 2 cases as a way to think about what are the possibilities, but also the, I would say, extremely substantial limitations that are basically in front of us if we want to pursue some type of criminal form of accountability in relation to Syria. So today for my talk structure, firstly, I'll just sort of give a little bit of an overview of where I think we're at in terms of questions of legality and legitimacy for the Syrian regime. And then I'll give some background as to generally the trajectory of international criminal justice possibilities that we have seen emerge since 2010. And then I'll focus in particular on CIJA and the IIIM and how they slot into that evolving trajectory. And then I'll talk about some of the recent trials we've seen in Germany, and then conclude by reflecting on the extent to which we have, a space for significant redress through this mode of accountability, which is international criminal justice. So firstly, I think it's really interesting to think about in terms of the legitimacy of the regime of Bashar al-Assad, because I think, as everyone in the room here will appreciate, the sort of fortunes of his own legitimacy, of the regime's legitimacy, has really waxed and waned. And I think we're at a moment, more generally in terms of politics, where I think the regime is coming in from the cold, and there are some sort of signals from the international community that it's becoming an acceptable actor, an acceptable player, such as, for example, the lifting of restrictions by Interpol, Bahrain reopening its Syrian embassy, even discussion about the Arab League no longer suspending Syria. And so I think we're at this moment where it is the regime is actually regaining a lot of its legitimacy that had been lost over the decade or so of the civil war. And I think here then the role of international criminal justice responses is crucial, because if we keep following this political trajectory of slowly, re-acknowledging the legitimacy of the Assad regime, well, then I think over time, then any sort of possibility of criminal sanction, of redress, will be lost. But I think if we do get the ability to pursue some robust international, or let's talk about them later, domestic criminal possibilities, then I think they are perhaps a very important way of challenging this emerging legitimacy or relegitimation of the regime. So here I am suggesting that there is a relationship then between legality and legitimacy. But of course, the question of the scope of possibility for international criminal justice responses has to be understood within a much more complex dynamic of, things like, will we have in the future enough funding, enough institutional support, domestic momentum to actually realise this aim? Okay, so I mean, when we think about international criminal justice, I suppose then perhaps firstly I should just give a little bit of background then as to what I am meaning when I'm talking about international criminal justice, and then also how it has figured or hasn't figured, has failed to figure in response to what we have seen as, I think we can widely agree, as being widespread state and non-state perpetrated atrocities. So I think initially when the conflict erupted in the early days, which initially was very much a civil conflict, civil disobedience, quickly spiraling into civil war, and then slowly morphing into a regional conflict. In terms of legal interest and legal responses, very much the reaction was framed around the idiom of human rights. So condemnations about a variety of alleged human rights violations. And this is distinct from international criminal justice, just to say that, and that the mechanisms available for human rights redress are distinct from international criminal justice. Human rights are basically concerned with the relationship of usually the state and an individual, or the state and a group. And so in that case, then it was questions about the extent to which the Syrian state had failed in its obligations to protect and respect the rights largely of Syrian nationals, and modes then of redress perhaps could have been linked in some way to some extant treaty regimes, but obviously largely through, let's call them, broader political pressure that would be brought to bear through the UN. And we saw that really, I think very clearly, that a lot of that rhetoric didn't really lead to any sort of tangible results. I mean, we did obviously have the establishment, for example, quite soon on, of the Human Rights Council's Commission of Inquiry, and I mean, I think its work is ongoing, but this type of work has been extremely important for providing, detailed documentation of various alleged violations carried out by both the Syrian regime and a range of non-state actors. But I suppose my interest here is to sort of think about how we got the shift, not simply to thinking about human rights, but actually the shift to international criminal justice. And international criminal justice is also concerned with responsibility, but it is manifested in actually the pursuit of individual criminal responsibility. So whereas human rights law tends to be concerned with state responsibility, but has actually evolved to consider a range of other forms of responsibility, international criminal law very much is through that framework of the criminal trial. So putting an individual on trial for crimes at the international level, for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. So in the case of Syria, then this perhaps could have manifested, for example, with the mandate for the International Criminal Court to open proceedings. It could have manifested through the establishment of a specialised tribunal. We've seen those in the past in relation, for example, to civil wars in Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia. We even saw it across the border in relation to the assassination of Rafik Hariri with the Special Tribunal for Lebanon. So that's sort of the typical mode of when we think of international criminal justice. You try to get the big perpetrators before a court that has established an international form of jurisdiction. And obviously, as I'm sure most of you are aware, those possibilities have never provided any possibility, unfortunately. So most famously, of course, we had the double veto by China and Russia at the UN Security Council, so preventing any form of International Criminal Court activity. And of course, we can assume that then that would also in the future prevent any possibility from the Security Council setting up a specialised tribunal, as, for example, we've seen next door in the case of Lebanon. So very quickly then, I think there was this recognition that, okay, these mechanisms that in the past we have resorted to, particularly in relation to civil wars, are not going to be available for Syria. So what other possibilities are there? And so I think one really positive lesson that we can take away from this experience in terms of international criminal justice and Syria is that we have seen that both state and non-state actors are willing to think creatively and to make new things possible. So I don't think all is lost by the lack of ICC action, and in fact, we can have a separate discussion about the failings of the ICC. I mean, even if ICC action actually had been initiated, that doesn't in and of itself actually necessarily provide what we're looking for either. But interestingly, I think once it was realised that we had all this activity in the Human Rights Council, but once we realised that at least at the really high level UN Security Council level, nothing was really going to happen, the focus then shifted to the General Assembly, and a number of states worked together to then set up the independent mechanism for Syria. Sorry, the International Impartial Independent Mechanism, IIIM, the mechanism for Syria in December 2016. And, some people have said, oh, well, this is, a precursor to an international tribunal. And, some people had thought about that perhaps as a possibility when it was being established. I mean, I think now, 6 years later almost, it's pretty clear that that's not going to be forthcoming. But some of its key sort of principles for its establishment were clear early on, and I think it's very much persisting in its work. And that one of the key aims of this mechanism is simply to be, or it's not that simple really, but is to be a repository of evidence. So it basically is very well funded. It's very well resourced in terms of the really very sophisticated requirements that are actually involved in terms of amassing the data that we have in relation to Syria, particularly in terms of the sheer volume of video documentation of alleged atrocities. So this is a central hub based in Geneva, where all of the sort of amazing activity that we have seen proliferate from a range of civil society actors can actually come together and be housed here forever, so to speak, or at least to be kept very secure, because one of the problems has been that initially when we had this sort of rush to human rights activism early on in the conflict, as I'm sure you're all aware, many people were thinking, great, let's record, on our phones, let's upload onto YouTube. And what we've seen is actually since that many of those posts or many of those videos were taken down, often because of alleged, violations of their content rules. And so, a lot of valuable material has actually been lost, or it's actually even just hard to store the sheer amount of material that has since been produced from the conflict. And so the beauty then of the mechanism is that it's able to house it, and it's actually sort of really at the forefront of international initiatives in terms of developing software to be able to search through video and paper documentation, we can say, to sort of save people from having to watch millions of hours of material, which much of the time is extremely traumatic. So I mean, that in and of itself is really quite new. We haven't seen this before in terms of other international criminal justice mechanisms to the same extent. I think as well we should see it very much as a hub, as a transnational hub for both state, but much more importantly, I would say non-state activity. So it's really trying to coordinate a range of civil society initiatives and actors that we've seen in relation to forms of human rights and also international criminal justice redress. And it's actually coordinated a number of meetings and has tried to ensure that there's some degree of consistency in terms of the standards and the work carried out by local, regional and international accountability actors for Syria. I think probably it would say that its most significant contribution, though, that builds on the repository side of its work is that it has been working extensively with domestic authorities, because as I've tried to point out, really the options available in terms of criminal trials at the international level are extremely limited, if not totally impossible right now. And so instead then really all of the effort is taking place at the domestic level. And so the IIIM in particular is probably the central node through which states, any state, can work with. If they have an alleged perpetrator on their soil, if they're suspicious of some activity, they can call on the IIIM with its huge resources, with its networks, with its expertise, to try to help it in building up a case. And so we've already seen quite a lot of work being undertaken by analysts at the IIIM, but also analysts actually in CSS, which I'll be talking about in a second, to try to actually basically make trials ready against individual perpetrators, whether in state or non-state activities relating to Syria. So I do think then that actually, although to date we can't really say that the IIIM has, I don't know, brought about some radical shift in redress for Syria, I think that the first few years of its work were quite painstaking, were quite slow, because it had to set up all of its systems, get people on board, build all of these partnerships with civil society. But I do think that as long as the UN is willing to keep funding it, and that is a question, I mean, its budget is quite large, as long as it keeps willing to be funded, as long as it continues to be funded, then in fact I think it will prove to be an incredibly valuable resource for the future. One of the civil society actors that the IIIM has been working with, one of the many, is CSS, and I've done quite a lot of work on CSS in particular, so I just wanted to share with you its contribution. And I think, again, it's quite a good illustration of the way in which we've seen the proliferation of creative responses to the, let's call them, frustrations of traditional international criminal justice in terms of the Syrian conflict. So this is a non-profit NGO that's registered in the Netherlands and has its headquarters in a secret Western European country. And its funding, unfortunately, is extremely volatile. And I mean, I think this is the problem more broadly for any type of question of international criminal justice for Syria in the future, that it will very much be at the fortune of donor money, and that's the case for CSS and to a lesser extent for the IIIM. But basically, it has had quite large contributions over the last decade from a number of Western European states, as well as the US and Canada. It's largely, I would say, finalizing its work on Syria. It still has some staff based in Syria, as well as Iraq, but essentially it feels as if it's sort of amassed enough material now, so to speak, and it's actually now moved all of its material over to the IIIM. At least it's provided copies of its 1.15 million pages. These pages, as perhaps some of you are aware, were smuggled out of Syria, and they're largely regime-generated material. And what's really interesting here is that something like the IIIM is incapable of doing this type of work. So the IIIM is, created by states. It's a UN body, and because Syria has not agreed to its work being carried out within its territory, and it's not under a Chapter 7 mandate of the Security Council, which would obviously, have binding power on all states as well as Syria itself, the IIIM is quite restricted in what it can do directly on the ground, and that's why it has been so reliant on actors such as CSS to be able to actually bring out this material. And oftentimes, it's been brought out at great risk, in a highly secretive manner, and many people have actually been highly critical of the way this has been done. As CSS as well has tried to amass quite a large trove of witness testimony. In particular, it's tried to harness the potential of regime defector witness testimony, because this type of evidence is really important for building, the big cases that we perhaps will see in the future, or the cases as we saw quite recently in Germany. And so I think that these two organizations that partly work hand in hand to date have perhaps not done as much as many Syrians would have wanted them to have done, but I'm trying to at least touch on some of the possibilities that they can provide for in the future. And just to then highlight this, one would be very much, as many of you are aware, the trials that have been ongoing in Koblenz in Germany for a few years. And I mean, most significant was only last month we finally got the conviction, the life sentence against General Anwar Raslan, who was the former head of intelligence department at the 251 branch near Damascus. And because of his role in the co-perpetration of torture, 27 murders and sexual violence. And what's crucial about this case is the role that both CJA and the AAAM have played behind the scenes in providing the support and the documentary evidence that was crucial in actually proving the allegations here. You know, in terms of assessing Koblenz, what this means for international criminal justice, what this means for Syria, I mean, and this is sort of as a way of concluding, really, is this a victory for Syria, for victims, for survivors, for the possibility of international criminal justice? Yes, obviously, in some form, but it's an extremely limited one. I mean, this at least is the first time we've had a court endorsing the finding of crimes against humanity in the Syrian conflict. So that in and of itself is a real victory, but it's only obviously in relation to two individuals, one high level, one low level. Most perpetrators are still at large. Most probably will never come before a trial. And remember, these trials are usually highly dependent upon, you know, jurisdictional circumstance and state willingness to be able to follow through on this. I think as well, you know, perhaps there's a danger in over-relying on something like the Koblenz trials as some sort of symbolic victory, so that perhaps some momentum might be lost, or some people feel that, well, you know, at least we've done that, you know, maybe we can move on to other things. And I think it's really vital that instead of that approach, that we instead see this as just the start of perhaps more activity, and that we can learn from this. I think as well, maybe the more interesting question for me is that, you know, international criminal justice, the international criminal trial, or obviously as realised in the domestic sphere, can only ever do so much. So I think perhaps many survivors from the Syrian conflict, who some of them took a direct participation in the trial itself, perhaps they're expecting too much from a criminal trial. A criminal trial, by definition, is a highly structured and limited mode of considering highly complex situations. In the case of Koblenz, some really significant allegations of crime were excluded ultimately from consideration, particularly forced disappearances. And so I think a lot of times people are expecting a lot from the trial. There's a limited possibility as well as to how people can participate, the extent to which just actual stories or sort of broad-based facts can be presented, because instead really they have to be translated into something that is legally legible, that can contribute to, you know, ultimately the conviction against the accused. So really then I think we do always have to sort of scale back our expectations of any criminal trial and situate it more broadly in a sort of transitional justice context, where the criminal trial should only ever be seen as one mode of redress for something that has to be a number of different steps, often at the same time and perhaps with the same material. So, I mean, the rich material now that we have, at least from the trial transcripts, can inform future initiatives. I think for our purposes, though, as well, we need to think about how, for example, the archives that have been amassed by the AAAM, by CJA, by other civil society actors, some of which had informed the trial, you know, how can these materials in the future serve perhaps broader and more inclusive forms of transitional justice, even just most simply in terms of truth-telling? For survivors. As it stands, most of these archives are not available to members of Syrian society. They're under lock and key, and there are very good reasons for that at the moment. But at some point, there needs to be, I think, more of a reckoning with how we try to use some of these materials and how we think more creatively about what we think of as justice. So I suppose then I'm suggesting that we do have some baby steps of of success in terms of international criminal justice after many years of deep frustration, and we do have domestic trials ongoing in other jurisdictions, usually of relatively low-level perpetrators. Maybe Koblenz, we can say, is something new here, but I think regardless of the developments we see in terms of the possibility of criminal trials internationally or domestically, perhaps we also need to think about the ancillary activity around the trial, and particularly things like what I've mentioned in terms of the material being amassed, the experience being amassed, the witness testimony, the activism involved, that actually will feed into broader modes of redress for Syrian survivors. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks so much. It's a marvelous presentation, Michelle. Michelle has about 10 minutes, folks. So if anyone would like to ask a question or make a comment, please raise your hand. Francesco, and then Carsten.
Hello, Michelle. Sorry, I'm in a cafe, so it's a bit noisy. I hope you're well.
Hi.
Thanks for the presentation. I was wondering, to what extent do you think that these fantastic work done by civil society as well as by institutions is going to represent a template, a model in future crises? And what's going to be the relevance of it? Do you think that is going to be something that can be replicated, or is it unique? Thank you very much.
Let's take a couple of questions. Carsten, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Just perhaps rather a comment or an additional observation I've had. You mentioned the trials, the cases in Koblenz, and there's a new one in Frankfurt, like a Syrian doctor who tortured and killed people, and who was even working as a doctor in Germany for a few years in a hospital before he was discovered. And that trial is ongoing, and we will see the results. Now, what I have experienced around these trials as well is another problem that we are facing in our liberal democracy, so to speak, that I think there's a lot of potential within the Syrian diaspora still to serve as witnesses, but often they are scared because a lot of pro-Assad or pro-Hezbollah people are living either for many years already or decades, or even are national, have the citizenship, etc., or have fled from the war and are putting increased pressure on potential witnesses, or are threatening or even injuring. That's why I've seen witnesses despite police protection. So we are facing that challenge as well, to mobilize the witnesses that are out there in the diaspora, but that are scared to talk, because often also our institutions are not capable of tracing each and everyone who puts a danger to these people. Thank you.
Let's stop there and let you respond, Michelle, and then we'll go to Reinhold.
Thanks very much. So, Francesca, firstly, it's a great question. I mean, I do think that the Syrian conflict in terms of international criminal justice basically very clearly shows us that the ICC has not worked. Like Syria never ratified the Rome Statute, that's fine, but supposedly we had this backdrop possibility of Security Council action. And if we had one instance of the need to act, surely it was the Syrian case, and that hasn't been possible. We know why, because of the structure of the veto within the Security Council. So I don't think we'll ever look on the International Criminal Court in the same way again because of its failings in Syria. But I think that the spin-off then has been a rethinking about how we think of international criminal justice and these, let's call them, lower level initiatives. So as I've sort of tried to highlight with the mechanism and with these civil society initiatives. And so, a lot of people are actually quite excited about the possibility of domestic trials, that perhaps there was too much emphasis at the international level, but actually why is that the case? Why can't we actually just also use the resources of domestic jurisdictions, especially ones where they do embrace the notion of universal jurisdiction? So I see the field of international criminal justice largely as a result of the Syrian conflict as radically much more fragmented than it was before, with sort of questionable legitimacy, questionable capacity, but that at least we've seen these, you know, interesting, creative responses to try to deal with all of these shortcomings. So I mean, I would just say that, yeah, I think we're just in a different place in 2022 than we were in 2010, and that there's no going back, and that I think Syria precipitated that, and that in future conflicts as well, I think we're going to see more of these types of initiatives. I mean, there has been discussion, I think it's still just discussion, about having a standing investigative mechanism. So, you know, basically like a group of people who would be ready to go to function as something like the IIIM, you know, for a future conflict. So again, I mean, I think that then does show how the lessons we've learned from Syria, people are thinking of in terms of applying for future conflicts. But it costs a lot of money. That's another thing. So we'll have to see whether whether there is the will for that. Carsten, thanks very much. I mean, obviously, I did feel a little bit reluctant to be talking about the German example, given that you're from Germany. But so thanks very much for that. I mean, I think this is a really fascinating point. I mean, typically, criminal trials and international criminal justice, you know, has as its gold standard witness testimony. Especially, you know, regime defectors is like, you know, gold standard, and documentary evidence is also good, but if you can't have witnesses corroborating it, it becomes far less watertight. So maybe part of this has to be a rethinking about how we value different forms of evidence, because, you know, the costs to the potential witnesses perhaps are just too high, and this also in terms of trauma. We've seen, because of some witnesses having been interviewed numerous times by different organisations in different settings, and so the problem of re-traumatizing, and then obviously the point you talk about, the problem of actual physical harm, maybe means that we need to rethink what type of evidence we use, and at least we do know we have massive amounts of documentary evidence. But yeah, I mean, I suppose, again, it's unfortunately a problem of domestic politics, and the extent to which, you know, Germany is capable and able to pursue this. I mean, what's your sense? Do you think since Koblenz in particular, there's the willingness to keep going with this and to invest the resources and potentially, you know, provide even more significant police protection for potential witnesses, or not?
I mean, the challenge is that there is a huge migration community of all shades, of all sorts, and it's very hard to keep track of everyone, but also the real influx of people coming from the Assad side. Also, by the way, what I heard from Belarus, targetedly channeled into Germany. So you have all this taking place at the same time, and there is absolute willingness from the civil society side to continue, from the state side and the prosecutor side to continue. And I think these are very valuable landmark trials that are taking place, and I'm very happy that this is being done. But of course, it is just another side effect where I hear from Syrians, from the community, from the refugee community, that they are afraid, quite afraid, from some elements in our society that are threatening them. Yeah. But it will go on. I mean, but it just is a pity that not everybody speaks out because they are afraid.
Yeah. Okay.
Michelle, do you have to go, or could you take one last from Reinhold?
Oh, one's fine. That's fine. Yeah,
Reinhold?
that's fine.
Reinhold?
Yes, hello. Thank you very much for your talk. I have two brief questions. One is that you mentioned that there are good reasons for limiting access to the archives of these repositories that you talked about. So my question is, I'm just curious about the specific reasons why access is limited or even stopped altogether. My second question is that, well, you mentioned the limitations of a criminal trial in terms of prosecuting war crimes and crimes against humanity. Now, one way to circumvent this or make it easier in various national jurisdictions, like in the Netherlands, for example, is that people are being prosecuted for their membership of a so-called terrorist organization. Now, that's obviously a problem when it comes to having a balanced approach, because for one reason or another, which we can probably discuss another time, none of the regime organizations are viewed as a terrorist organization. But there are some developments here where still membership of a criminal organization can be prosecuted. So I was wondering if you know a little bit more about whether that has been thought about in other jurisdictions or even at the level of international criminal law. So thanks very much.
Thank you. So the first question, in terms of why the material is not available yet publicly, it's because of almost what Carsten's talked about. Because once we would know more of the details of who was doing what to whom, who was reporting on whom, who is defecting, it could lead to massive retribution and lack of safety for various witnesses and people everywhere. So there needs to be some way of redacting dangerous information, for example, and it's just so difficult right now to do. There's just so much material, and so that's one, like basically safety for sort of anyone somehow implicated through the evidence, and the even just the effort involved in trying to work through that, as you can appreciate, would be massive. And second, that I suppose at the present point, I think a lot of these actors are trying to work out how to use the material for the trial purpose. And so they're trying to sort of keep it under lock and key strategically for that. I mean, obviously, the defense counsel, if it went to trial, would be provided with the material. But I think just as in terms of strategy, the thinking is that it would not be in the best interests of possible trials in the future to have it all available, to know, what is actually out there. So I think they're the two main reasons. And obviously the counter is that, survivors should also have access to this, and often it actually implicates them and their families. But we haven't got to that stage yet because it's just too volatile. Yeah, I mean, your question, I don't know the details. I mean, I can say that I think too many of the trials so far in relation to Syria have been in relation to terrorist offences from non-regime actors. They seem to be the low-hanging fruit. They seem to be the easier ones to get. And so I think that we will see more of these types of cases at the domestic level, whether it's membership of a terrorist group or perhaps some sort of other terrorist offence. But I think that your question about membership of a criminal organisation, it's a really fascinating one, and I don't think that it's been formally pursued. But the question would be, well, can we actually define the Assad regime as a criminal organisation? And if we do get evidence as such as from Koblenz, where it actually clearly delineates how the regime was structured to then perpetrate crimes against humanity, that would then, I think, really provide an impetus to be able to make that definition stick. But I don't know the ins and outs of it. I mean, we have that, but on the other hand, what I'm trying to say is that it seems like the Syrian regime internationally is becoming more acceptable. So this could be, again, a very difficult case to make politically for states at the domestic level. But I think maybe some civil society actors could try to push this. I haven't heard of it myself, but thanks for alerting me to it. It does sound potentially like a promising avenue.
Well, thank you, Michelle. I'm very grateful that you were able to take the time to spend with us, and I wish there was more time, but perhaps there'll be other opportunities to further pursue this. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Sorry, Carsten, actually. Okay, thanks, Ray. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
So, Carsten, it's over to you then.
Thank you very much, Ray, and for inviting me today. And I see that the accountability track and the humanitarian track are now two topics that we discuss, and you could add recovery track, reconstruction track. that we are discussing, because there is no political change track on the Syrian scene anywhere. So also, I guess in the UN itself, a lot is being discussed about other things than, as it was called in our mediation design in Geneva, the basket one, which is governance. But I precisely wrote about the humanitarian side as well, because it is in the end, of course, also quite political. And the reason why I wrote this book, Syria and the Neutrality Trap, was because I was always preoccupied by this connection. You know, we had, I mean, when I was working at the UN with the envoys, and we always had this interlink between humanitarian issues and violence and the political progress. And I remember that almost Staffan de Mistura in 2016, January, was not able to start the political process because the opposition rejected coming to the table under heavy shelling and this humanitarian disaster. And we've never had any confidence building measures that would, in an ideal or normal mediation process, happen before a negotiation. We never had that even until today, release of detainees or you know, humanitarian gestures that are large enough or big enough and significant enough to make a political change in attitudes. So what struck me was, so that's why I wrote about it, and it was not my main file. That's why I could write about it a bit more freely than if I had written about the political process as such, because then I would have had to either hide a lot or discuss a lot of things that you would not air, at least not 2 or 3 years after the negotiations. But I was puzzled by a certain mismatch of our international practice. It is that in certain years of this conflict, the regime, when I say regime, by the way, I mean the wider structures. I don't mean it in a normative sense. The government would be the cabinet, etc., and we all know that it is without any power in Syria. The regime is the militias, the mukhabarat, the whole state structure, wider state structures that are responsible for humanitarian access, for the warfare, etc. So that 90% of humanitarian aid went through the regime, while if you look at the statistics, for example, of the Syrian Network for Human Rights, some 90% of the destruction and the humanitarian suffering was caused by that same regime that receives 90% of the humanitarian aid. And it was daily routine that convoys were barred, access to areas that were in dire need. And so I was wondering what's really behind this international practice. So this practice, channeling humanitarian aid primarily through the government in question here, is not more and not less than a humanitarian practice, an international practice. But it is a practice, and it has some foundations of some General Assembly UN resolutions and other practices, but you also have a counter view and a counter school in international law that would challenge this practice. Indeed, Syria is a case of extraordinary, massive humanitarian disaster and human rights violations. And that's why it serves so well as an example of malpractice, if you like, and perhaps also lessons learned for future conflicts, where we have to make sure that some of these practices and also errors, also partly of the UN, will not take place again, hopefully so, if there is any learning curve. Now, we have in Syria a very difficult general situation that was there. The political actors, but especially the humanitarians, on which all the burden rested because of a lack of a political solution, were acting in an age of growing bilateralism. We are still in it, although Donald Trump is not president of the US any longer, but there is a dwindling of the binding force of universal norms and international legal positions. That's the observation among many scholars of international law. And this has become particularly obvious in the Syrian scenario. I would say both in the active sense that norms are violated, and in the reactive sense, basically, that the violations of red lines are not met with adequate responses. So we had also in that scenario the problem that key political actors had no consensual and coherent reading of international law, international humanitarian and human rights law. So arguments were used selectively and aiming to advance national interests, of course bilateral interests, and there was no attempt of any coherent multilateral and sustainable approach to a political solution. Now, the UN agencies and other international organizations were caught in the dilemma if they should work with the incumbent government as a difficult partner under its very restrictive conditions as well as they can, and or choose the other way, which was working somehow in Syria without or against the consent of this government. And that would have meant to pull out from Syria and work only in those areas where the rockets landed, which was mainly in the north, and not where they were launched. That was Damascus, where most of the humanitarian aid ended up, and was then also diverted, etc. We have also the situation that, of course, the UN has many different agencies that sometimes have turf wars with each other, don't coordinate with each other. But the UN is also all countries are members. That is, those countries on this and on that side of the aisle in that war. So there is also, it is quite, I would say, normal that you have different staff members of the UN leaning towards this or towards that side. And perhaps more in a national way of thinking than in the thinking of international humanitarian and human rights laws, unfortunately so. Now, the book focuses especially on the international legal presumption that, or obligation even, that a state and its government have a particular responsibility and obligation to protect its citizens, both in the international and non-international armed conflicts. And therefore, the onus is clearly on the Syrian government and wider regime, even when it is in a situation of survival and felt under siege in particular moments of the crisis, it does not diminish its legal obligations. And therefore, there was, you know, the Syrian state's claim of absolute sovereignty was striking, in particular when its sovereignty was diminishing on the one hand on the ground, objectively speaking, because they lost territories, they lost even the border checkpoints, but also when it comes to legitimacy of its people. So that's why they they had a strong interest in relating their own discourse of sovereignty to the outside world. And here also, by the way, I thankfully could fall back on a very helpful article on of Reinut also, who has focused on that issue. Now, what I think so it's very important to notice is that when we come to the different the controversies around Syria, the clashes of different angles towards the Syrian issue, we see the wider picture, which I've tried to sketch, which is actually the interpretation of international law nowadays and the interpretation of sovereignty. Now, it looks like it that we have that we are in a tug of war. How to interpret sovereignty? Are we going backwards towards the absolute and hard notion of state sovereignty, meaning a government and with territory, etc., all these the criteria fulfilled, do have sovereignty no matter how they treat their own population? Or are we still holding on to the progressive notion of international law that emerged in the 1990s after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the bipolarism of the Cold War, where we have a conditioned state sovereignty, where it does not matter how a state treats its people, where, according to the progressive scholars, even cross-border international aid can be delivered without the consent of this country, of this government, if it rejects the humanitarian aid out of capricious reasons, and even without the consent of the Security Council. Then what we are doing in international practice is to ask in the Security Council, is it okay that the UN can deliver cross-border aid to those areas that are completely isolated and blocked by deliveries from the Syrian government side? Cross-line aid does not work. That's why cross-border aid from Turkey has become necessary. And it happened the first time in 2014, as you know, when a cross-border resolution was passed. Now, we have accepted, now we are already on this side of the story that we have accepted that as the Security Council resolution needs to decide about it, despite a massive, and I think in Syria hardly anyone could have questioned it, a massive humanitarian disaster and massive conscious and targeted violations of human rights. Still, we went through the Security Council, and that's the practice until today. That made it possible for those who interpret international law differently, hard sovereignty, Russia, China, were able to put pressure or even to ask for gives and takes. And this has happened now in the past years in the prolongation of the UN Security Council resolutions on cross-border delivery. The most recent cross-border resolution entails for the first time recovery, or includes recovery as one of the items that could be given in return for humanitarian access. So what is happening here is that suddenly you start trading humanitarian things with non-humanitarian things. You start trading things that are supposed to be self-evident since the Geneva Conventions with something that is a political concession. So the door has been opened here, and that is a slippery slope and quite dangerous, I would say. Now, the half-yearly or yearly discussions about the cross-border resolution is only the surface of the deeper debate behind it, which is the different interpretations of state sovereignty. So that's what I'm trying to make clear in that book as well. I'm also focusing on something that I call an integrative warfare of the Syrian government and wider regime, which is a strategy of warfare that systematically and unscrupulously takes advantage of all international resources available from different sectors, including the humanitarian one, in order to use or abuse them on the ground by channeling or absorbing humanitarian deliveries in its favor, or even profit from the international presence in other forms. You may know in other conflict scenarios, there were regimes, militias, or even governments in place who expelled humanitarian actors. It just pushed them out, and there was no humanitarian delivery. They saw the international presence as a biased presence that was not in their interest. In Syria, it was exactly the opposite. So there was a government, or there is a government in place that cleverly understood that international presence is valuable in many ways. On the one hand, it is a resource of legitimacy and international discourse. You can say you are a reliable international partner. You have the UN flags everywhere in your country, but it's also quite resourceful when it comes to finances or a kind of a money laundering system where humanitarian actors were or are compelled to buy most of their goods, up to 90% of their goods, from Syrian businessmen, who then also, of course, pay their share to the regime again. Or we have a distorted exchange rate where any money transfer from the humanitarian side towards actors in Syria is already lost 50%. So if you transfer $1, 50 cents goes to the regime already. And there are many other stories and the whole system, how it works. I try to describe in that book from different sources, also from interviews from people on the ground, former UN staff on the ground, etc. Now, I'm not doing, and I think most people understood it who read the book, I'm not doing UN bashing. To the contrary, what I'm trying to do is to save the UN from losing more and more credibility and to increase somehow its credibility and performance. But I do, that's not me, by the way, that's actually already researched by media and by think tanks, put my finger into the wound where the UN did things on the ground that are very difficult to understand for a humanitarian actor. And, and in this situation, it was very difficult to understand why, for example, certain high-ranking UN representatives were putting in interviews and public statements unnecessarily strong emphasis on Syrian state sovereignty, with implications, of course, for international law, humanitarian and human rights law, and the government's political posturing. There were individual staff in Damascus who identified probably too strongly with the government. That's one possibility, or at least were careless also in choosing local partners on the ground, because it has been, as you might have already read, it's not new, discovered that a lot of those partners the UN has shouldered up with were in fact not charities or no innocent NGOs, but prolonged arms of Assad state militias, or the procurement practices in general, or the fact that close relatives of government, high-ranking government people in Damascus were employed in UN agencies during the conflict. I'm saying during the conflict because it's quite normal that these upper-class people who are multilingual, etc., often get jobs in the UN and other international NGOs. But that happened during the conflict precisely because there was a bridge or contact needed to the Syrian government. And I heard from UN staff members on the ground that and humanitarian actors in general who were in sessions, in strategic sessions, and they were afraid to air their opinions. They were afraid to speak because they knew there were relatives of government, of the vice foreign minister and so on at the table who would report everything directly to the mukhabarat, which would of course make them a lot of problems. Now and then the UN has also been in the dilemma, of course, either partnering with that regime, but the question is under which conditions. So in 2012, when the government established this strict regime of humanitarian action on the ground, the question is, could there have been more collective bargaining? Could there have been better bargaining? Was it necessary to accept all the rules? Because the hard choice to withdraw completely from government-held territory would have implied, of course, again, as well, that other people who need humanitarian assistance would not get it. But there are NGOs, smaller NGOs, who decided not to work in the government territories, but already before 2014, when the cross-border resolution was in place, to sneak into the north because they don't need the UN Security Council to approve it, only the UN. So they sneaked into the north and helped where the bombs were falling with makeshift clinics in the basement with high personal risks and dangers. And they, however, had the problem of being seen often by the donors as non-humanitarian NGOs because they were working with the rebels in the north. And I know that from ministries, etc., that it was very hard and a longer process to somehow recognize or to, of course, to vet these organizations. Often they didn't have all this experience to deal with so much money, with administrative issues, but they also had to somehow justify themselves. Why are they working in the north and not in the government territory, while all the UN money almost goes to the government territory? Are they pro-rebel? Are they political? Are they camouflaged rebels themselves? And I talked to some of them how difficult it was for them to step by step getting recognized as humanitarian actors as well. Now, I don't want to make it too long, so that I'm skipping a few things, but I would like to close with a few observations that I make at the end, where I put forward 6 arguments why business as usual cannot go on, arguments for change of that practice in general. So the first argument is the need-based argument. This is a purely humanitarian argument, because humanitarian assistance, if things go on as they do in Syria and did, humanitarian assistance does precisely not arrive at the most needy and does not reach enough needy as humanitarian principled aid is supposed to. And under such circumstances, the principles of impartiality and neutrality become a farce. The second argument is the argument of international humanitarian law. So strong, as I mentioned, contemporary legal opinions support also alternative forms of humanitarian cooperation, like cross-border deliveries in extreme situations against the will of the respective state, and if necessary, also without the consent of the UN Security Council. But this is not where we are. So the goalpost is already shifted towards one side. It's not in the center anymore, perhaps, if we see the 2 discussions in schools in international law. However, this position also might become more fragile if we continue to see and witness the erosion of multilateralism and the taking hold of the pretension of hard state sovereignty, in case it gradually returns through the back door. And there are some examples where it returns. And I've heard and I've discussed with diplomats that who told me that formulations in resolutions in the Human Rights Council and elsewhere, who were previously consensual formulations for decades, are now being questioned by Russia, of course, by Syria, by Venezuela, by North Korea, by all the usual suspects. For example, humanitarian cross-border aid needs the full consent of the state, of the high contracting party, the state in question. So not only the consent, but the full consent. I mean, it's semantic nonsense, but we know where it leads to in diplomatic language. So there are a lot of shifts, gradual shifts towards that one direction. The third argument for change is the value-based argument. So that diverted and abused humanitarian assistance may strengthen unscrupulous regimes in an already asymmetric conflict as we are facing it in Syria. And those regimes commit large-scale violations of human rights that have become an integral part of our universal value system. And of course, some will argue this is not a universal value system, but a Western one, etc. I would just like to remind those people that this is in the Charter of the United Nations, and the countries are voluntary members of this organization. So this cannot be only Western values, and the Geneva Conventions either. Now, the fourth argument for change is the mediation-based argument, where I've worked in, and I've seen it every day. A stronger party of a non-international armed conflict where you have this asymmetry, and it's mostly the state has more possibilities of channeling and abusing humanitarian resources to its own advantage. And the resulting increased asymmetry renders any form of third-party mediation, especially by the weak UN in a way, more difficult, if not impossible. For it takes away any incentive of the stronger party to come to the negotiation table. And this even may prolong the conflict, do more harm, and prolong the humanitarian suffering. The fifth argument for change is the credibility-based argument. And in practically all of today's ongoing conflicts, if you look at Libya, Yemen, Syria, the UN has failed to achieve a mediated political solution and has provoked heavy criticism of how its personnel and agencies have been handling humanitarian and other assistance. Although in Yemen it has the UN had been was in these years a bit stronger and often withdrew its humanitarian support, and then the party, in this case, mostly the Houthis, they came back and said, okay, we grant you access and you please come back. So, but we have seen the vigor of discontent in the Syrian case against the UN in a way, and the UN's need to adjust and conduct internal investigations, although they have not really led anywhere. But you might remember the parameters and principles of 2017 were there to remind their own agencies of the humanitarian principles with regard to Syria. But all this didn't really go very far, and this may leave a lasting mark on the organization that at the same time has to defend its added value in difficult times of skeptic bilateralists and nationalist leaders, of budget cuts, and lacking concerted support for its peace initiatives and field missions, etc. Now, the sixth and last argument for change is the economically based argument, which is obviously diverted and abused humanitarian resources may drown millions of dollars and euros in a war economy that keeps the conflict going. It may also strengthen structures of a predatory state and element regime cronies. And during the conflict, in which the state is a party that doesn't care about its people, it unburdens the state from delivering state services indiscriminately and enables it to use its remaining resources to cater their clientele and to create further destruction and humanitarian suffering. So I hope you got some idea of some of the things I wanted to bring across with this book, and I'm looking forward to your questions and to our discussion.
Thanks for a fascinating presentation. Do you want to just let the audience know the publisher and where they can access your book?
It is on Amazon, and it is on most of, you can find a list of content and reviews and all that, and a bit more information about the book on my website, which is just www.carsten-wieland.de. And otherwise, it's available in all the, I think, major in all major bookstores and Amazon, etc.
And the publisher is
it's IB Torres.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we do have 15 minutes, so if you're interested in making a comment or asking a question of Dr. Wieland, please put up your online hand. And if I'm not seeing your hand and you're trying to raise it, please just speak up. Well, I'll fill the vacuum until other people collect their thoughts. How can I ask, how does one balance between the desire not to let the regime profit from humanitarian delivery and the fact that there are millions of Syrians living in regime-controlled areas, which are really in a very dire situation? How do you balance this?
Yeah.
And just to add a little thing at the end, you referred to early recovery measures as somehow political concessions, but don't they overlap a lot with humanitarian purposes?
Yeah. All right, and these are very crucial questions, and it is a huge dilemma. And I have also talked about it in the book as a dilemma, and there are no easy solutions to that. Also, we have to distinguish between the period of the heavy fighting and today. We had starved areas that were really under complete siege, like a middle-aged strategy of sieges, where still the humanitarian aid got to this regime that starved its own people in certain areas. So it was much more dramatic, and the north was heavily destroyed, while some areas, of course, in the government area territory was not. Now today, you have, of course, easier access through the north. Turkey has occupied certain territories. but it's always a question of the UN, because if the UN falls away, the numerous smaller NGOs cannot fill the void, because money-wise, and it's also a money flow that is well established. Nobody can really replace the huge UN machinery. So this one border crossing that is still left now, Bab el-Hawa, is quite crucial to the areas in the north. But on the other hand, you have a lot of NGOs that work in the north without, of course, any possibility of Assad to prevent that. And you have an increased economic and dire economic situation in the government areas that are, of course, born not in the first place through the sanctions, but born by the government's decision to embark on military escalation, the security solution, and this kind of uncompromising warfare that led to this situation, and by the regime's unwillingness to engage constructively in the political process in Geneva, where I think there was quite some willingness by countries to engage with a government in recovery, reconstruction, etc. Now, today it is much more difficult to somehow try to renegotiate the terms of engagement in Syria, in Syrian government territories than it was in 2012, when, or even later, when the regime, or up to 15 until the Russian intervention took place, where the regime stood basically with its back to the war, and somehow was able still to use its negotiating power with the internationals to keep them first in the country, and secondly in the country under their conditions. Today, of course, the asymmetry in this conflict is far bigger, and it is far more difficult to change any terms of kind of behavior and regulations in Damascus. Maybe on the local level. Now, you are talking about recovery. Yes, recovery is often now. Recovery is, for example, windows in schools, while plastic bags in front of the windows are, or makeshift windows are rather humanitarian things. Yes, it does serve humanitarian purposes, but on the other hand, it embarks towards reconstructing infrastructure that is critical for the state, and that is something that the state also is supposed to deliver for its people. And it's again a huge dilemma. On the one hand, most donors know that if humanitarian aid was abused and diverted and so on by the same regime, recovery and other money that flows in will be abused in the same manner. And it is not a corrupt regime because of the war. It used to be a corrupt regime already before the war. So, but it's a huge dilemma to what extent you are willing to engage in the rules of this government that does not engage a iota in the political and diplomatic efforts to resolve the conflict. Maybe it is resolved militarily, if you want to say that. It is, I think, one understandable point of view. There are many conflicts who have been resolved militarily, but it will not shape a long-lasting peace, and it will not shape a better economy in Syria. And that's why the regime is largely responsible for the situation again, because there is willingness and there is money, but under which conditions can it be spent, and under which conditions will it really reach the needy, both in humanitarian levels and on the reconstruction arena as well.
Thank you. I see we've got three questions. Let's take them, and then we'll have time for you to respond to them. So the first person that had their hand up was Killian Baltz. Are you there?
Yes, hello, here I am. Thank you, Carsten, for this very interesting talk. I was puzzled by one issue with regard to international law. You appeared to be in support of the traditional concept of multilateralism that also depends on a on the traditional architecture of international law on the one hand. On the other hand, when it came to humanitarian assistance, you seem to be very critical of the traditional approach to humanitarian assistance that effectively uses the state as the gatekeeper, and that in the Syrian case, of course, is counterproductive, but that from the perspective of international law is supported by the fundamental concept of state sovereignty. And how would you reconcile these two trends? On the one hand, the Syrian concept is about the failure of the traditional concepts of international law, and then on the other hand, humanitarian aid, effective humanitarian aid, would require to rethink these concepts. Thank you.
Let's take a question from Tina, and then from Reinhold, and then Carsten will have time to respond. Tina?
Hi, Carsten. Very good to see you, and a great presentation. I liked it a lot, and I completely agree on most of the points, even though the dilemma is so stark. My question would be actually just a fact-based knowledge question, as I, of course, followed the German position and also the multilateral UN position, but I would be curious, it would be good to know which bilateral, which actors actually have entered the scene already, but already again bilaterally, and provided assistance to the regime, and also perhaps if you could shed light on the GCC actors, because I expect there might be some movement there as they have taken up diplomatic relations again. Thank you.
Okay, and Reinhold?
Yes, hi, Carsten, thanks very much for your talk. Very interesting. Just a couple of very brief questions. You didn't say much about the concerns widely shared during the conflict from the start about the manipulation or misuse of aid by rebel groups, and especially those designated as terrorist organizations. So can you say something about that, and more precisely, in hindsight, does their actual manipulation of aid justify these concerns and apprehensions, even to the extent that many aid providers, including UN agencies, kind of stayed away from dealing with these groups? Could you also perhaps give us a brief update on this issue when it comes to UN aid provision to Idlib and in the presence of Hayat al-Tahrir al-Sham, HTS? And then more on a personal note, I was curious what the responses were within the UN agencies to your book. Thanks very much.
Would you like to respond then, Carsten?
Yes, thank you for this very good and also difficult questions, but that's why they are good. Kilian, first on the international legal discussion, I indeed did not put into question the multilateral arrangements themselves. Of course, everybody would probably agree that the UN needs reform. The Security Council is a child of the post-war area, etc. But what I quote or kind of juxtapose also in my book is actually different protagonists of international law, professors, whatever, book authors, and what we have you know, people who have taken up high positions in international courts. And I have compared, and I have seen also studies by academics that were written for governments in that time, in that crucial time, where they argue within the existing framework that in this extreme situation, international humanitarian aid can be delivered cross-border without the consent of the state, the host country, and also with actually even without the Security Council. But of course, that's a very theoretical academic view, because if you do that, you need to be ready politically and practically to somehow protect the humanitarian actors who enter a country against the will of the government. Well, in this case, also the government is the only side of the war that had air power. So you would have needed a no-fly zone, at least, to do that, I guess, in a larger scale, you know. So there are always several layers of this argument. I have followed the legal arguments of the different authors, that I felt this split, this cleavage within that community, and I know these practical studies that were in the ministries as an option, as a political option, to fall back on these legal arguments, but they were not chosen. And now that's again a political question. Why were these arguments not chosen by perhaps European states or the US? Because there was a lack of political will to engage. Because if you buy that view, and you need to engage somehow, or you need to somehow protect the humanitarian actors, you need to foster cross-border aid, and you really need to make sure that humanitarian aid reaches also the besieged people, etc., etc. So that would have implied a kind of a chain reaction of political decisions and probably also military decisions that were not ready to be taken. That's why here again we see how humanitarian and political arguments somehow blur. Tina, yeah, well, I mean, I think several countries have already some development organizations, but also perhaps primarily in the Northeast or in the Northwest, or even some UNDP, by the way, which is of course not bilateral but multilateral, is quite active and present in Syria. And you mentioned also the GCC actors. If you look at the normalization tendencies and the actors who are there lining up, you can also very easily discover that the kind of reconstruction or the kind of investments that they will be doing is probably quite different of what the Europeans would have done under the condition of progress in the political process of the UN in Geneva. Because on the one hand, maybe money is flowing in also from allies of Assad, and this is about infrastructure, airports, everything that is necessary to keep up a state in warfare. Then if you look at the UAE, might be shopping malls, hotels, etc. But it's probably not housing for the refugees to return, because we know that this regime doesn't want refugees to return in large scale, although it keeps claiming otherwise. But we see on the ground that the human rights situation is not conducive enough, to put it mildly. And what I've seen also of actors who do support normalization, for example, Jordan, with its large border, with its long border and large refugee population, has good reason somehow to try to de-escalate, perhaps, and normalize in a way, perhaps more than others who are far away. But then making those statements that refugees don't return because there are no houses, that's why we need reconstruction, simply eclipses the human rights aspect of the problem. Because if you ask the refugees why they don't return, they will not tell you because we have no house, because Syrians have improvised quite a lot and they will rebuild and so on. And if there was a possibility, they would go back. But they cite the problem of fear of being arrested, of being detained, of being raped at the border, all things that we have heard in the different reports. And therefore, when it comes to activities on the ground, one has really to look at to which constituency do these activities really cater, and probably very different from the Europeans. And at least most Europeans have said that without a political process, a meaningful political process, we will not engage completely, despite this dilemma that Ray also mentioned of a population that also suffers under Assad. Actually, the biggest argument against my view, against what I've just said, is education, because you have a lost generation into the, in the future years if you don't have a sufficient education. But education alone schools alone will not bring the refugees back either. It is the political situation, it is the human rights situation in Syria that bars people from coming back. And it will not change without the political process, without the willingness of a certain political change in Syria that improves this human rights situation. And Rainut's comments, yes, I do mention that in the book as well, the misuse of aid by rebel groups, but I felt that it was necessary when it comes also to international law to focus on the special responsibility of the state. And since in the beginning of my talk, I did mention this discrepancy, 90% of aid goes to Damascus, 90% of destruction is done by Damascus. And that's why I'm focusing on this very this asymmetry and that very visible problem that is in the first place not a problem of the rebel groups. Nowadays, of course, and you have a radicalization of the groups throughout the years. You have, of course, corruption. You have checkpoints where you have to pay. Where you have a fragmented scenario. Where humanitarian organizations do have to make compromises as well, but you don't have a hard and well-organized systematic regime of curbing the liberties of humanitarian actors on the ground, and also violating, in that case, international humanitarian law consciously by a state actor that at the same time is a member of the United Nations and at the same time receives 90% of the aid. And that was why I focused on this state behavior in the first place. And the responses of different UN people to the book, there were and are UN people who really appreciated the book and who also encouraged me to go ahead with it. And there are probably others who have not talked to me to such an extent, who were, of course, attacked by the book in a way, or feel somehow that this book is biased or that doesn't do justice to what they did in Syria as when they were in that posting. But what I felt was tendencies like normal staff on the ground, UN staff on the ground, were quite skeptical to their own organization's behavior and talked to me also, and often had already left the UN. There were some in the humanitarian system in the UN, but higher ranking, who were also quite sympathetic to this project. And in particular, there was, of course, the political department and the political actors within the UN who kind of despaired, even with the parameters and principles that they enacted, that this task force that was supposed to be monitoring the adherence to these principles has not even met once after 2017. At least until the book was written, and I haven't heard anything that it has really happened. And I also know that donors have been highly frustrated with the UN's perhaps also flat learning curve, or also some UN's behavior, and have tried, as you have observed as well, probably when you look into the issue, a certain diversification, to embark on a certain diversification of aid, also from humanitarian funds into recovery funds where you can do other things, and you don't need the approval of the Security Council because that is the humanitarian issue, or humanitarian plus, which then would also go into recovery, which is taking place, but in that sense mostly in non-government areas, but of course to an increasing extent, not only from the UAE investments and all that, but to an increasing extent also in regime territories.
Thank you very much, Carsten. I think we've come to the end of our session. So would everybody please join me in expressing appreciation of this marvelous presentation and discussion. Thank you very much, Carsten.
Thank you.
thank you for this great round of questions. I would have loved to be in St. Andrews and answering them and seeing you in person, but I hope that we can do that soon again.